We're a little bit behind on our schedule, but that's okay. Just keep reading in order. World War II, and then the Cold War and civil rights. So we'll do what we can to get caught up towards the end, and if we have to be brief on stuff towards the end, we will. All right. So last time we took a look at a film. Not a very pleasant film to watch, but again, I think it's very important to keep in mind that World War II will see a dramatic increase in the intentional targeting of civilians as a successful strategy of war. Right? And we'll conclude with that today with the dropping of the atomic bomb. Right? So where are we as far as the last discussion of World War II? We had just briefly taken a look at the rise of Japan, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany. And Hitler, by the spring and into the summer of 1940, has virtually conquered most of Europe at this time. He had he had made a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and then consolidated his territory in the east and began to shift expansions west and north. He will have conquered by 1940, into the summer of 1940, again, most of Europe. In the summer of 1941, he then turned his attention on the Soviet Union and broke that non-aggression pact as he continued his expansion to the east. Right? So the point is, what is the United States doing during all of this massive campaigns of expansion throughout Europe, particularly by the Nazis, by Hitler? All right? A couple of just reminders of sort of where we were, interwar diplomacy. The United States had passed what were called the Neutrality Acts back during the mid-1930s. This was designed to keep us out of a war based upon how we believe we had been manipulated into the First World War. And so again, there are no weapons to be sold. Cash and carry was one of the policies here. But the problem is that Germany's conquest of Europe is going to change not all of that, but it's going to influence what we do, how we respond to them, right? So that by, again, into 1940, when we see that Germany has conquered so much of Europe, and really all that stands between, or all that is left that is not conquered is largely Great Britain, right? England. And it is Roosevelt's number one objective to do whatever it takes to make sure that England does not fall to the Nazis. Now, again, geography is going to be a big part of this, being an island nation. But at the same time, Roosevelt is hampered in terms of what he can do, right, because of the Neutrality Acts. They went into effect, again, largely trying to keep us out of this conflict, right? I think the first thing we should consider in terms of Roosevelt's opinion and his perspective is that Roosevelt is an internationalist, right? He is not an isolationist. He's an internationalist. And he very much wants to make sure that England does not fall to the Nazis. What are most Americans thinking at the time, though? Well, as late as the summer of 1941, about 80% of Americans said, we're not getting involved in this conflict. We are not getting involved in World War II. There is a tremendous isolationist attitude and perspective on the part of the majority of Americans. And despite all of Roosevelt's intentions and desires to help England, he can't go against 80% of the American people, right? So he is somewhat limited in how he responds. Okay? First of all, what he was able to do, I think, again, this is this is Roosevelt as a politician trying to maneuver around the law. He eventually gets Congress to allow weapons to be sold under cash and carry. That'll be the first sort of, what we might say, change in terms of the Neutrality Acts, is that weapons will now be able to be sold under cash and carry. And again, we're talking about weapons to England at this time. Most of Europe is gone, right? He had begun a very interesting project known as the Manhattan Project in 1939. This is a very secretive program designed to research atomic energy, and ultimately out of the Manhattan Project will come the first atomic weapons, which we'll come back to at the end of the lecture here, the atomic bombs that will be used on Japan. A very, very secretive program. Very few people knew about this in Roosevelt's own administration, particularly the vice president does not even know about this program, right? Roosevelt was always very secretive in terms of his overall policies, his agenda, his goal, where he was headed with this. Most people did not know exactly where he was going with this. In 1940, there is a tremendous increase in military spending because it becomes quite clear that the United States Army, the Navy is pretty solid, but the Army is almost non-existent at this time. So Roosevelt will get Congress to initiate the first peacetime draft, as it becomes clear that eventually the United States is going to have to get involved in this conflict one way or another. Right? Now we consider this first peacetime draft. That's a pretty profound moment here, that we're not even in the war, and yet we are requiring young men to serve in the military. I think this largely has to do with the fact that the United States Army at this time was literally a joke. We almost have no army whatsoever. And by the end of 1940, we will have 1.5 million young men with some basic military training. Right? And then in 1941, Roosevelt will get Congress to largely abandon this idea of cash and carry for weapons and implement a policy known as Lend-Lease. Right? Now, why abandon cash and carry? This was largely designed to protect or help protect England. But England is broke. They have no money. They're not in a situation that they can even buy weapons from us. So Roosevelt is, again, this is Roosevelt as the, kind of this master politician, but he always could come to the American people and kind of explain it to them in a way that they would understand. And he basically said, because here's what Lend-Lease said, right? If your neighbor's house is on fire, and he comes to you and asks if he can borrow your hose to put the fire out, what are you going to do, right? Well, this isn't necessarily about him and his house, but what might happen? That fire may jump to your house, right? So it's actually in your interest to just loan him the hose and let him put his fire out. And if, after all the fire's out, the hose is okay and more or less intact, he'll give it back to us, right? So this is what Lend-Lease becomes. We are going to loan the British weapons under the guise of, whatever is still working after this conflict is over, they can give it back to us, right? Now, there's no intention of ever getting any of this stuff back, but it's Roosevelt sort of manipulating the situation to be able to help England build its defenses against Nazi Germany, right? Lend-Lease, okay? Now, what ultimately gets the United States involved in World War II? Pretty simple. This is the interesting question to think about with World War II. It's pretty obvious. I don't like to make these sort of absolute judgments about good and evil and right and wrong. Those things oftentimes are very misleading historical arguments. But it's pretty obvious. I think most of us should be able to agree that the Nazis are the bad guys in this situation, right? And after World War II, how often do you hear that World War II is a just war? We had to get involved in this war. Again, Holocaust and all these sorts of things. The World War II is a good war, right? And we did a good thing by going over there and defeating the Nazis. If that's the case, if that's the argument you're going to make, why did it take Pearl Harbor for us to get involved in this war? That is, why is it that not until we are personally attacked did we suddenly become so concerned about joining this war, right? I think that's a very important question that Zen is asking, and again, the chapter called "The People's War?" Right? It's a very important question to consider. Why did it take our own personal attack and being attacked before we could then suddenly justify being involved in this war? Right? It in many ways undermines this attitude that it was a just war and we had to do it for moral reasons, right? It was really more for personal reasons. We had been attacked by the Japanese, right? All right, now having said that, let's consider what Japan is doing. This is I think we briefly looked at this map before, but Japan is systematically conquering most of Southeast and East Asia, right? Again, we saw this with Manchuria back in 31, full-scale invasion of China in 37, officially began World War II. The Japanese then begin to move into Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia. Again, what is Japan, what is their primary purpose here? It's access to natural resources. A small island nation, they are an industrial giant. It is the petroleum, rubber, lumber, timber, all these sorts of things that are coming out of Southeast Asia, right? And so by the time we get into 1941, this is the extent of Japanese expansion, right? Keeping in mind that the United States and Hawaii right here are sort of on the edge of this expansion, okay? So what happens, of course, is that Japan has to make a decision, right? They can either continue their policy of expansion, but if they do, the real threat to Japan is going to be what? There's only one threat. That is the United States Navy, right? So if they're going to continue their policies of expansion, eventually they're going to have to deal with, or at least attempt to deal with the United States Navy. What was the United States doing during all of this expansion by the Japanese? Well, remember, this is the late 1930s. This is still the Depression. For a lot of this, we're selling the Japanese petroleum. We're selling the Japanese scrap iron. That is, they were one of our customers, right? But when this became too aggressive, too much expansion, Roosevelt, again, threatened sanctions. If they don't stop, they don't stop. So we will isolate or freeze all Japanese assets and banks. And it's at this point that Japan has to make that decision. Continue on, and if so, deal with the Navy of the United States, or stop. Well, we know that they don't stop. They, again, will attack the United States naval forces at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands on December 7th, 1941. Right? Now, in this attack, the Japanese brought 6 aircraft carriers, 300 airplanes. They moved across 3,500 miles of the Pacific Ocean in perfect radio silence to attack at dawn on December 7th, 1941. In this initial attack, the United States was caught off guard, sinking 19 U.S. warships, 8 of which were U.S. battleships, right? So we get a sense of why the battleships were so easily, the targets were so easy here, is that it's called Battleship Row. They were literally lined up here, and as the Japanese Navy and Air Force were coming in, these ships were more or less sitting targets, right? 200 airplanes were destroyed by the Japanese, and over 2,500 American dead. And this is the event that ultimately brings the United States into World War II. Right? Now, the Japanese in this attack, again, you can see the battleships primarily lined up here. One of the things that the Japanese, again, you can see this massive explosion, petroleum sinking, leaking out into the bay, or into the harbor. But the Japanese did make 2 fatal mistakes, right? It's what they didn't attack that's most important here. They did not attack the fuel reserves, right? And perhaps most importantly, they did not attack the repair facilities. That is, the ability for the United States to repair most of these ships. So of those 8 battleships that were sunk, how many of them were permanently sunk? Only 1. Only 1. 7 of them are able to be repaired and put back to sea, right? And today, in Pearl Harbor, the one ship that was permanently destroyed, the USS Arizona, right? A monument to World War II and the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? So the point was that while this appeared to be initially a knockout blow, in fact, it was not nearly as permanently damaging as it might first have appeared. Most of these ships are able to be repaired and sent back into service, right? But the point is that this is what got us into World War II, the personal attack by the Japanese. The United States Congress declared war on Japan. Japan obviously returned the favor because Japan had an alliance with Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazis then declared war on the United States. Germany declared war on the United States, and we once again returned the favor. So now we are completely enmeshed by December 11th, 1941, in World War II. All right? This is what got us into this. Now, in terms of the war, I do think it's important to consider what our first primary goal was. Despite the fact that we had been attacked by the Japanese, this is where the United States recognized what the greater danger was. It was not Japan, it was Hitler, it was Europe, right? So from day one, despite a personal attack by the Japanese, which was the justification to enter into the war, the strategy was to beat Hitler first. Take care of Hitler first, right? As we saw, Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, so about 4 months earlier, 5 months earlier. So notice now what's just happened. Because Hitler is at war with the Soviet Union and we are now at war with Hitler, the Soviet Union and the United States are now allies, right? This will be a very uneasy alliance because of the communism, capitalism, ideological conflict. But at this point, the United States absolutely needs the Soviet Union, just as the Soviet Union absolutely needed the United States. So it's one of those things where you can set aside your differences to deal with the greater threat, which of course was Hitler and the Nazis, right? What is the key to our success, the overall Allied success? Millions of Soviet soldiers, right? And the United States' ability to build a war machine, right? It is these two forces jointly combined that will defeat the Nazis, right? So we consider the long-term consequences. All of the Allied nations, and the big three, of course, the United States, Soviet Union, and England, right? The last three big nations that have not succumbed to Nazi aggression here. When we sort of look at the casualties, right? When I say millions of Soviet soldiers, Russian soldiers, the Soviets lost 70 times more soldiers in World War II than all other Allied nations combined. 70 times more soldiers, right? This is the key then that we'll come back to, is that, Stalin, somewhat concerned about the United States' overall objectives here, right? Why is it that the Soviets are losing so many men here? Because this is the only real front, if you will, between the Nazis and the Soviet Union is this Eastern Front. What is the United States doing? When we say beat Hitler first, but what are we doing? Where are we at? What are we attacking? Right? Well, we'll go to North Africa. We'll work our way up through Italy. Right? Eventually, we will amass a massive military on Great Britain and attack on June 6, 1944. Right? But we had promised Joseph Stalin a real second front, that is a Western front, somewhere on, from Hitler's perspective, a Western front, as early as 1942. Now, why is it that it takes us 2 years? 2 years. Now, that's a matter of perspective, right? Obviously, Hitler has most of Europe under control, and it would have been folly to try to attack that without, being prepared and kind of softening his defenses in other areas. But what is the Soviet perspective on that? 2 years it took us to get to Europe. From a Soviet perspective, perhaps this was on purpose, that the Nazis and the Soviets would kill each other off, and then the United States and England would come in victorious, right? Now, I'm not claiming that that was the intention, but that is going to lead to problems after World War II, that the Soviet Union is going to be quite suspicious of the intentions of the United States. And what I'm kind of headed for is not so much World War II, although we're going to take a look at some issues here, but how World War II sets up the Cold War after World War II, right? This conflict between the communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States, right? This is one of those little moments here where the Soviets said, why weren't you here 2 years ago, right? And again, the key here was American industry. How are we paying for all this stuff, by the way, all this military? Debt, right? Debt. Again, this is that Keynesian economics. This was that New Deal policy, but it's the justification for a war. Nobody's questioning massive expenditures and government putting people to work at this point, because of course the objective is to fight the war, right? But the policy is still exactly the same. We don't have any money to pay for this stuff. It's all debt that the federal government is incurring to pay for this war machine. Okay, there's a lot we could do with World War II, and I have to make choices here. I'm not going to fight the war itself, battles and etc. I'm just simply not going to do that. I'll talk about maybe a couple, but I do think this is a moment to consider some developments and issues and topics during World War II, particularly in terms of civil rights and civil liberties, right? Because one of the things we did during World War II was to lock up 144,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps, right? Why? Why did we do that? Right? Well, the belief was, or at least what we were told, is that we didn't trust these people. We didn't know their loyalties. Were they working for Japan? Right? And what we're going to start to see here is a very interesting aspect of how you dehumanize the enemy. Right? Because once again, it is not easy, despite the fact that we tend to do it all the time, it's really not easy for humans to kill other human beings. This is something that you have to be taught, and it's really easier if you consider the enemy to be less than human. Right? So it is amazing how often the Japanese are going to be depicted not just as the enemy, but as an enemy race. Right? And the evidence of their inferiority would be the barbaric attack at Pearl Harbor, for example. This is an image of Emperor Hirohito, right, depicted as a bat. It was amazing how many times you would see floats in American parades supporting the war effort, right? And here comes this big American eagle with missiles coming right behind it. And where is it headed over in the corner of the float? These scurrying yellow little rats, right? Again, the idea was that the Japanese were not human beings at all, right? So why did we do all of this? Notice we didn't do this to Italian Americans. We didn't do this to German Americans, right? It is only the Japanese Americans. And I think most of this comes back to the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? This was an act of revenge. The government had to be seen as doing something in the absence of actually attacking the Japanese home islands. Right? 144,000 Japanese Americans systematically rounded up and sent to internment camps. I think in many ways this is similar to what happened after 9/11, when a lot of people of Middle Eastern American descent had to sort of lay low for a little while, right? Because, again, hostilities with 9/11. So we see this is a Japanese American grocer, right? And notice the big sign on the front, right? I am an American, right? I have to reestablish this. These people were given 2 weeks' notice to liquidate all of their assets. What does that mean? Sell your house, sell your car. Have you ever tried to sell your house in 2 weeks? Right? Probably not, most of you, right? But when you get there, you're going to lose a huge amount of money on doing that, right? So the problem was these people were given almost no time to prepare, and where they were going, they didn't exactly know, right? People were, again, being put on, and notice the imagery here, right? Being loaded up onto trains. Right? Where did we see something like that before, right? Now, I'm not suggesting what's about to happen is being sending these people to concentration camps, but you can get a sense of sort of similar disregard for the humanity of these people, right? The camps that they were sent to, most of the time they weren't even completed yet. Right? They're not even done. Power wasn't even there. If they had flashlights, they were all confiscated. Right? Why might they confiscate their flashlights? Because it was believed that they might signal Japanese aircraft. Right? Now, there are no Japanese aircraft, right? Again, this was acts of punishment here for what had happened with Pearl Harbor, right? Again, 144,000. Why were they being rounded up? Why were they told they were being rounded up? For their own protection. For their own protection, right? Interestingly enough, this is a modern photograph of one of the camps. Most of these camps are in California and the West Coast. The barbed wire on the on the fences, right, were designed to keep people in, not keep people out, right? The machine gun turrets that were mounted on top of these towers, they were not pointing out at the sort of, the Americans that were coming to get them, right? They were pointed in to make sure that these people did not leave, right? Now here's an interesting question. You have just been rounded up and put into trains and then sent to one of these camps, and as a young man, you then receive a draft notice to go fight for the country that just did that. Now, a lot of you are young men in this room here. Your family has just lost most of its assets. You have basically nothing left but what you could carry in. And then the government that did that to you said, now we need you to go fight for us. What do you do in that situation? How do you guys respond to that? Just out of curiosity. You guys go fight? Would you fight for a country that did that? Or your family? I mean, again, it's kind of a personal question, but what happens if you don't go? Well, you're already locked up. I mean, that's not the issue, right? But what does it say? What's the confirmed traitor? It proves that we were right to lock you up to begin with, because obviously you're not a loyal American, right? In fact, the Japanese soldiers, Japanese Americans coming out of these camps, they overwhelmingly went and fought for the United States, overwhelmingly. And in fact, in Europe, some of the most decorated units consisted of Japanese Americans that came from internment camps, right? But notice the, sort of the salt in the wound there, right? It's kind of a catch-22. If you don't go, then obviously you're not loyal, right? So we were right to lock you up to begin with. All right, so Japanese Americans, and the Supreme Court, as late as 1944, even closer to the end of the war, not the end yet, but closer to the end, as late as 1944, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld their detention. That is, these people are not getting out until the war is over. Right? That's pretty much what we were saying here. Right? And by the way, who authorized this? What right did we have to do this? Well, we had no right to do it. This was about power. And ultimately, who signed the order to lock these people up? Franklin Roosevelt did. Absolutely. Right? It's the internment of Japanese Americans, a black eye on civil liberties in the United States. Okay? All right, let's consider as well, perhaps the last major event of the war, this decision to drop the atomic bomb. Okay. Now, this is one of the most controversial issues coming out of World War II. And again, this, having seen that film last time, will help maybe put some of this into perspective. Right? The Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. First of all, as I said, going very quickly as far as the war goes, the Germans were defeated and surrendered on May 8th, 1945. May 8th. Right? Keep that date in mind here. We'll come back to that in just a moment. May 8th. Okay? So the war is over in Europe, but it obviously still rages on in the East, in Japan and in Asia. Right? So at Potsdam, we have a conference of the leaders of the Soviet Union, England, and the United States. Now, by the way, Franklin Roosevelt had just died a few months earlier in April of 1945, so he did not see the end of the war, but his vice president, Harry Truman, took over as president. Right? Now, one of the things about Truman that we should consider is, first of all, Truman is no Roosevelt. All right? Truman was not the skilled politician and refined politician, the subtle politician that we would see with somebody like Roosevelt. Right? Politicians are about compromise and persuasion, and Harry Truman was, shall we say, rather direct, rather blunt. He told you what he was thinking. And when you're in the midst of rather complicated world-affecting negotiations, that's not always the best strategy, right? Having said that, though, Truman walks into a very difficult situation because he had been kept in the dark by Roosevelt about so many policies. Like, for example, this idea that we actually have atomic weapons that we could use, right? So, in the Potsdam Conference, Truman announced this decision to use some kind of a weapon on Japan if Japan did not unconditionally surrender. Right? So an ultimatum was given. Interestingly enough, the Soviet Union was not part of this ultimatum. And when we tried to talk to Stalin about what this weapon was, we didn't give him any great details about it, of course, but we tried to explain a little bit about just how powerful and devastating it would be. He was kind of dismissive of the whole thing, right? He was not terribly concerned, and we thought perhaps he didn't understand what we were trying to say. Well, he understood exactly what we were trying to say. He knew all about the Manhattan Project. He knew all about the atomic bomb because he had Russian spies in Los Alamos, in New Mexico, and understood exactly what was going on. In fact, this is how the Soviets, the Russians, will get the bomb later after the war. Right? So we announced the decision to use some kind of a weapon if Japan did not unconditionally surrender. Notice that when we demanded the surrender of the Germans, there was no unconditional surrender there. Right? And what is it primarily that the Japanese, when we say unconditional, what is it that they want? What might be a condition that they want? Well, they wanted to keep their emperor. More than anything else, they wanted to keep their emperor, right? But we were not going to accept that, okay? Now, here's the big question with the dropping of the atomic bomb. Was it necessary? Was it necessary to drop the atomic bomb? Now, this will be a debate that goes on forever. This is going to come down to perspective and opinion, and we just want to consider it from a number of perspectives. Okay, I'm not here to answer that question definitively, more to sort of throw out some ideas here and let you come to your own conclusions about it. Okay, here's the big issue with the dropping of the atomic bomb. First of all, we had been fighting the Japanese in the Pacific for several years. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Midway, the Philippines, Okinawa. This is what we saw in the film last time, the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese throwing themselves over the cliffs, right? Because the policy for the Japanese primarily was they wouldn't surrender. They wouldn't surrender, right? Particularly their soldiers. They're going to fight till the last man. And we'd seen that time and time again on all of the various island campaigns that we had conducted over the last couple of years. The Japanese soldiers simply refused to surrender, which means they were going to fight to the end. And this was going to take or result in American casualties, for sure. Right? Now, Harry Stimson, this is the Secretary of State under Truman, estimated that it would take approximately 1 million American lives, that is service personnel, to successfully attack and conquer the Japanese home islands. That was what Stimson said. Roughly 1 million American lives would be lost. Now, this was based upon what we had seen in terms of estimates from the Japanese unwillingness to surrender in previous island campaigns, right? Perhaps as many as 1 million American lives. Now, exactly where that number came from, I'll revisit that here in just a moment. But obviously, this was going to take or cost American lives. Now, this is the question in terms of why it's controversial. Even if this number is high, right, you're still going to lose American lives in the attack of the Japanese home islands. It doesn't matter what the number is. How do you go to some American parent, mom and dad, and say, we're going to need your son to give their life to invade the Japanese home islands instead of using this massive weapon we hear that could end the war? How do you justify that? How do you tell parents that, right? That, again, if it was one American life, how do you do that, right? So this is the issue here. Just whether this number is big or slightly inflated or not, it's still going to cost American lives. And how do you go to the American people and say, we're going to need the sacrifice of your children unnecessarily, right? Because we have this bomb that could end the war anyway, right? So this is where this becomes very controversial, right? And very, again, obviously impassioned on both sides of this argument, right? Well, let's consider the status of the Japanese military as late as sort of the summer into the fall, late summer of 1945. Okay. The United States had destroyed not just one Japanese navy, but two Japanese navies. There is no Japanese naval resistance any longer as of the summer of 1945. What about the Japanese Air Force? Well, we saw some examples of how desperate they were, right, in the film. What were the Japanese resorting to? Kamikaze pilots, right? So the problem here is that the Japanese have airplanes, and they have pilots, but they have no or little ammunition and little fuel. So they resort to kamikaze pilots not to sacrifice for their emperor, but out of desperation. They have very little else to use, right? What about the Japanese army? Where's the Japanese army at? Well, it's not in Japan. It is largely in China, right? And this is too one of the problems. Remember in the film that there was this call that the Japanese civilian population should rise up and defend the island at all costs, right? Why are they being told that? Because the army is not there. Most of the army is in the mainland of China. And so the United States began unrestricted bombing campaigns since the spring of 1945. So we saw some examples of this bombing, particularly firebombing, right? Notice that, I don't know if you caught that number or not, but when we bombed Tokyo, that was after we had already bombed 65 Japanese cities, right? 65 of them, right? So the problem now becomes, what ability did Japan have to resist at this point? Very little resistance left, right? In fact, when we look at the decisions, because we know that Hiroshima is going to be the target here. Why is Hiroshima chosen as a target? Because there are no targets left. No other targets left. Right? Now, I think it's real important that we consider Russia in all of this. All right? May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. May 8th. And Russia said, the Soviet Union said, Stalin said, that we, the Soviet Union, need 3 months to prepare, to transport troops and equipment to help the United States invade the Japanese homeland. That is, the Soviets would be there with us 3 months later. They just need some time to deal with the aftermath of the war. May 8th. June 8th. July 8th. August 8th was the date that the Russians said they would be there. And they are preparing to help us invade in August of 1945. But here's the problem. Do we want the Soviets to help us with the invasion of Japan? No. It's not that we don't want their help, but what's going to be the aftermath of that? You're going to have Soviet boots on the ground in Japan, and now what do you do? That is, who is in charge of Japan? Okay? Now, I'm going to come back to this after the war, but one of the conflicts that we'll have to look at after World War II is Korea, right? And this exact problem had just taken place. Northern Korea has Soviet troops. Southern Korea has American troops. I'll detail this in a future lecture. We divide the country in half, north and south. Why? To keep the Americans and the Soviets from getting close to each other and for fear that they might shoot each other, right? So, do you want to recreate that whole situation now in a much larger population, a much larger situation in the Japanese home islands? Absolutely not, right? So what was the date that we dropped the first bomb? August 6th, 1945. 2 days before the Russians said they would be there. Coincidence? No, not a coincidence. Right? The first bomb was dropped August 6, 1945, killing 140,000 Japanese, mostly civilians. Mostly civilians. It was interesting, the number of people who said to Truman, don't drop the bomb. Don't do it. The military said, don't do it. Dwight Eisenhower, Allied Supreme Commander in Europe, don't drop the bomb. It's unnecessary. Right? One of the problems here is that American, when we say, what ended the war in Japan? What's the obvious response? Well, dropping the bomb ended the war, right? Well, what does that do to the sacrifice of hundreds, well, tens of thousands of Americans who had slugged it out in island after island after island for the last 2.5 years, right? It almost is dismissive of their sacrifice that, well, it was the bomb that ended the war. No, it was the American military that so weakened Japan that we could then justify the dropping of the bomb, right? But it's the bomb that's going to get the credit, and the military said, don't do it. It's unnecessary. The scientists who built the bomb said, don't drop the bomb. Don't do it, right? It's going to create a nuclear arms race, right? Because once this technology is out there, other countries eventually will get some form of it, if not exactly what it was, right? Which, of course, is exactly what happens. The Soviet Union gets this in the late 1940s, right after World War II. So, who was it that said, drop the bomb? It was the politicians and the advisors around Truman, right? Because notice what this dropping of the bomb did. Not only did it end the war, although technically it didn't end the war because, again, 140,000 killed. It leveled the city. But we dropped the second bomb. 3 days later, August 9th, in Nagasaki, killing 70,000 people, right? Now, again, we can, 70,000 people, obviously a very large number of people, but almost that same number of people we killed in just the bombing of Tokyo itself through firebombs, right? So it's not necessarily the amount of people, although it's hard to, we start talking about thousands and thousands of dead here, right? But it was the technology that was unleashed here, right? After the dropping of the second bomb, Japan surrendered, right? Unconditional surrender. Not interested in keeping the emperor. We're done, right? So obviously it was very clear here that dropping this bomb is what ended World War II. The Japanese surrendered unconditionally. We do find out, very interestingly, in 1947, so 2 years later, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of State, who estimated 1 million American lives, said in Harper's Magazine that was a made-up number. Right? Why that number? Because we just needed a big number, right, to justify the dropping of the bomb. Right? He admitted this 2 years later. It's not unlike what happened a couple years ago with the TARP fund, right, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the thing that everybody get all upset about. $800 billion. Where did that number come from? Just needed a big number, right? Again, not a lot of evidence to suggest that much money is necessary. Same thing right here, right? So again, the decision to drop the bomb is still very controversial, but without question, it brought about the end of World War II, right? About 2 weeks later, now the Japanese had officially surrendered, or had agreed to surrender, but it takes a couple weeks to work out all the negotiations. September 2nd, 1945, known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan, Victory over Japan, World War II officially came to an end. Was it necessary to drop the bomb? That's, again, a matter of debate, right? If you frame it that way, was it necessary? You could easily answer no, right? But at the same time, how do you justify the death of Americans needlessly? Right? Again, that's why this is such a controversial issue. What was the real reason we did this, though? who is the message sent to?
Russia.
To the world, actually, but to Russia specifically, right? It is a statement of this kind of power that the United States now has, right? And this kind of power can be brought to bear anywhere around the world at our time and our choosing, right? It's a statement, a projection of power that is going to now that the United States is now going to enter into, well, the world is now going to enter into another conflict that will last clearly the rest of our semester, the rest of our class, the Cold War, right? Which doesn't end until the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Very interestingly enough, one particular scientist, when they were doing all these tests on out in the South Pacific on various islands or what are called atolls, right? An atoll is sort of an uninhabitable island where they had conducted many of these, atomic explosions and tested, for research purposes. One particular scientist said a few years later in the 1950s, when he saw a two-piece bathing suit that a woman was wearing, because this will become fashionable in the 1950s, it reminded him of, it so kind of freaked him out, right? This kind of explosion that when he saw this woman, it reminded him of these atomic explosions out in the South Pacific. And the name of one of the atolls that they did one of these explosions on, anybody know what it's called? Bikini Atoll. Bikini Atoll, right? So again, this is where the term bikini will come from, the explosion of atomic weapons out in the South Pacific, right? So this is the end of World War II, and this is going to now, the way World War II ended, the way it ended is going to set up a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. All right, this is the Cold War. Okay, and this is what we're going to talk about next time, the Cold War. Okay, we're going to get out just a little bit early today. Does anybody have any questions from anything today?